All right, so try to get through this very quickly because I know that I've got to record for this class. I got to record the second part in the next class, and I got to post all of that for Ms. Tulk's class, who's going to be listening to the lessons online, and then they get to do the newspaper, and hopefully none of them make it to the reading passages because that's not what I have planned for today. We're going to get into the Civil War. So we're going to start off with the Missouri Compromise, and what you're probably going to realize is some of the reading and the things that we did about the Battle of Fort Sumter. We're going to kind of go backwards in time a little bit, like pre-Fort Sumter stuff, and talk about some of the things that kind of led up to the animosity and the reasons why we went to war. So this is in 1820. This is kind of what's going on in the United States. Still don't own everything all the way across. We do remember the Louisiana Purchase. There's like 3 nods. Awesome. 3 people listen this year. And so we know that we doubled the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase. I could kind of see all of that up in this area here. And so we have something going on now where we have a very set amount of free states, a very set amount of slave states. And kind of what's going on there is if you have an even number of free states and slave states, both states kind of felt like they were getting equal representation, but when new states started to decide to form, we started to get into an issue. So again, we all know about this. So Missouri began drafting a state constitution because they were going to become a state. And James Talmadge said, I'm going to put in some anti-slavery amendments into the bill that would create Missouri as a state. Well, if it's anti-slavery, what does that mean?
That means like they're against slavery.
So it would be against slavery. So now all of a sudden, you have a state that's coming in and they're saying that we're going to be a free state. And on the surface, that sounds kind of innocent and easy, but here's what's going on. Half of the states were free, half of the states were slave states, but because the free states had larger populations, they controlled the House of Representatives. And so they had equal representation in the Senate. At least they kind of listened to themselves. Remember that whole no taxation without representation? They were now being represented because of the way that they drew up the Constitution. But admitting Missouri as a free state or a slave state would upset that balance of 11 states on each side. Anti-slavery members said that slavery should be prohibited, means not allowed, in the new states. And pro-slavery members in Congress said that the state should have the right to decide if slavery was legal or illegal within its borders. Now that gets into a whole other thing about states' rights. Maybe we'll have some time at the end of the year once our EOGs are done. They still argue about things like this all the time. Not slavery in particular, but like the government should decide it or the states should be able to decide for themselves about certain things. And they talk about that a lot. So that's going all the way back to here. So a compromise was made. A compromise when you come to agreement that kind of helps both sides, right? When Maine applied for statehood, according to this deal, written by Henry Clay, if the southern states would agree to the admission of Maine as a free state, Missouri would be admitted as a slave state. And then they started dividing up Louisiana Purchase. Everything above north of a latitude would be free states. Anything south of that would be slave states. And both sides agreed to this compromise. And so we'll see some things that happen because of the Missouri Compromise later on. Now, Chloe, if I'm writing, I know how important this is. I'm going to be very honest with you. I'm probably still going to skip this in my newspaper because the people that I'm about to talk about are just way too cool. All of them are so cool that I would probably skip this, although it's ridiculously important. You could easily write an entire paper on the Missouri Compromise and be fine, but I'm not going to. Who's heard of Nat Turner? Wow, no hands. That's a shame. Super cool dude. I'm glad to be able to teach you about him. Nat Turner, he was a slave, and he was also a preacher, which is kind of different. And this time, slaves were considered property, like no different than the stuff that you own in your backpack. And like if I wanted to give the stuff in my backpack to AJ, I can do that, and he can give me stuff from his backpack. And they were treated no different than that, which is awful. And they had no rights. Like, they weren't allowed to learn to read. They weren't allowed to write. They had like no rights of anything whatsoever. They're treated like way subhuman, which is the sad and terrible part of slavery. But the plantation that Nat was born on belonged to Benjamin Turner. He died, and his kid took over. And under the kid, Nat Turner was taught to read and write at a pretty young age, which is not usual. That was very illegal. Slaves were not educated at all, and it was illegal for most of the times. And Nat Turner was an extremely religious person. Anytime that he wasn't working or anything, he was reading his Bible, he was fasting, he was preaching, praying and preaching to the other slaves, which is kind of awesome. And so as he was reading, he found some things in the Bible that kind of let him know that not only is slavery wrong, but I need to confront these people about slavery, because according to what he's reading in the Bible, it should not be going on. And as he got older, religion became even more important, and he decided it was time to take action. He was going to recruit other slaves, right? Hey guys, I got this plan. Let's capture the armory. Caleb, what would they have in the armory? Weapons. And then they were going to go to the Dismal Swamp, which was a little, does that sound like a great place to go? The Dismal Swamp. Sounds horrible. And if they went there, it'd be very difficult to capture them. That reminds me of like when Princess Bride, when he goes into the fire swamp. They had no training, no organization, they had no planning skills. But on the night of 21st of August in 1831, Turner and 7 slaves launched their campaign. They were looking to free as many slaves as possible, and they decided that they would kill anybody that got in their way. Over the next couple of days and nights, about 60 people were killed by the rebels. And by that time, their group had grown to about 75 people. All right, so we're back on here. That's a great question, though. So again, they went around from plantation to plantation, killing as many people as they could. Now, again, when I'm thinking of an armory, I was thinking that they had like giant muskets and stuff, but they didn't. It was knives, axes, and hatchets. Now, I'm going to be very honest with you, that's a pretty violent thing there. So at the end of this, about 57 people died. And then a large militia, a giant army came in, reinforced by 3 companies of other militia came in. And by the end of that, 100 black people were killed, including the rebels, and many innocent people, blacks who had nothing to do with it whatsoever. For weeks after the rebellion, blacks were killed in Virginia and North Carolina in retaliation to what happened with Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat eluded capture for months, but he was finally found in that Dismal Swamp in October. He was hanged on November. The rebellion resulted in laws that restricted religious assembly for slaves without the presence of a white minister, and for teaching slaves to read and write. I think this will become very important as we move on later on. So again, like I said, I'm probably going to go ahead and skip the Missouri Compromise, and Nat Turner would be one of the first people that I would talk about, but that's just me. So again, the issue of slavery was very contentious between the two states, and there was very heated words that were used between the two. They definitely had very opposing views on the two. The South couldn't understand why the North didn't understand how important slavery was to their economy, because you cannot process all of those cash crops without a large workforce. Now, like, you should probably pay for that workforce and treat them fairly and not enslave them, right? I don't think that the South had a lot of, no, they don't have any legs to stand on, but again, their opinion, like, slaves were not people. They treated them as property. I mean, it's really hard to understand somebody else's perspective when it's that ridiculous, right? Like, I can't put myself in their shoes because I just can't understand that. But again, I think I can understand why the people in the North were so against it. Southern states, they actually got a victory, and they passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This called for the residents of a territory to choose. Again, this is back to popular sovereignty or states' rights. Northern politicians like Abraham Lincoln and abolitionists who hated slavery, they fought against this bill. And then when Lincoln was elected, he would repeal that bill later on. But again, the southern states, and this has not gone away by any means. If anything, it's gotten worse over the last little bit as far as like what states can choose to do. I know that this became a huge issue when we were during our COVID times. There were some states saying we are going to wear masks everywhere all the time, 24/7. And in some states are like, nah, we're kind of done with this. We're done wearing masks. And then the federal government was like kind of stepping into some of those places, and it got pretty contentious back then too. So again, here's Lincoln. He's on the rise, and so the southern states started to worry that Lincoln would emancipate means to free, would free the slaves. And then the 1859 raid on a federal arsenal by John Brown, we'll get into that, a radical abolitionist, heightened those fears, and the South thought that the North was like really trying to take over. After Lincoln's election, South Carolina seceded, then we had Fort Sumter, and then the other states would secede. Then you had the Confederate States, and then you had the northern of the United States, which would become the Union. So the North. I know that we all want to think that everybody up north was like super anti-slavery, but I'll be honest with you, sometimes they weren't as anti-slavery as we make them out to be. I just think that they didn't feel like that slavery should be as used as widely as it was in the South. And then some people honestly really didn't have an opinion one way or another in the North. We know that life as a slave was difficult. Work constantly, hot, cold, didn't matter. They're not worried about feeding you, horrible conditions. And again, slaves were bounced back and forth from place to place. And, just imagine having your family just randomly broken up one day, and then you just never see your mom, dad, brother, sister, cousin, grandma, whatever again, because somebody decided that morning that they, I'm going to sell 3 of these people to somewhere else. And it's like, your family's like broken apart, and it could be you left alone. Like, people don't think about like the mental, they talk a lot about the physical aspect of slavery and all the beatings and things like that. And that's awful. I would argue that the mental aspect of that was probably 50 times worse, right? Never knowing if you're going to get beat because you just don't know what might set off one of those plantation owners on a random day, and always worried that your family members could get sold. If somebody in their group knew how to read and they were having like these tiny little religious meetings, like worried constantly. I mean, I'm sure the mental toll was just ridiculous. There's probably some books out there about that. I think that would be interesting to read. Here's one that honestly and truthfully, if you don't put this in your thing, I would really question. Harriet Tubman. I know that we all know who Harriet Tubman is. Like, lots of nods going around now. If not, then listen. Probably the most famous American woman in history. Araminta Ross was her name when she was little. She was named Minty from an early age. She worked as a servant in a plantation house, so she grew up a slave. And we'll see in the video, when she was younger and trying to stop something happening to another slave, she got hit in the head with like this giant weight. And it caused her to have like this narcoleptic, like these fits where she would just like fall asleep. And so, it's wild. So, thinking about that is very difficult. But again, she thought she was about to be sold, and I think she was worried about being moved away from her family, which was what we just talked about. And she knew that there would be huge punishment if she was caught, but she decided to take off in the middle of the night. And she got some help from some Quakers and some other people in that beginnings of the Underground Railroad. If you get a chance, and I think I might have that attached in here. If I don't, I'll find it. But these specially designed blankets and paintings on buildings, and you can still kind of go see those in some of the places up in the mountains of North Carolina. They still have some of those things on some of the buildings and barns that kind of let people know this is a safe house. If you're a runaway slave, you can come here and stay. Looks like we're coming to the end of the 15 minutes on here, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this